Welcome to the second hour of Turning Hard Times into Good Times, now being aired at jtaylormedia.com. Well, I'm really pleased to have with me for the first time Stephen Harner. He was introduced to me by Gene Epstein a couple of months ago back at the New York City Junto meetings that Stephen attended, that particular meeting anyway. And, of course, Gene Epstein is well known to our listeners here because he is on this show frequently. And Gene was kind enough to introduce me to Stephen, and he is the president of Yangtze Century Ltd. That was formerly Harner and Company. That's in Shanghai, China, and he is a principal with 30 years experience. Stephen provides investment advisory, management, consulting services in China and Japan. He specializes in mergers and acquisition, due diligence, and risk management advisory, as well as business development advisory in Japan and China for financial service companies. And Stephen is the author of Whither Japan. That's a blog at Forbes.com. And previously, Stephen was Chief Risk Officer and Vice President at Ping An Bank, Independent Director at Bank of Hangzhou, and President at SM Harner and Company, Harner and Limited, I should say, Shanghai, China. Mr. Harner is educated at Johns Hopkins University, School of Advanced International Studies, with a concentration in international economics. Welcome, Stephen. It's really good to have you with me today.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
It's really interesting to talk to somebody, an American who has had and lived so long in Asia. How many years have you spent in that part of the world?
Over 30 years.
Over 30 years. So you bring, a wealth of experience being there that long. You bring the American culture into that experience, and the United States, of course, we're the only country to ever have dropped a nuclear bomb on another country, and it would seem to me that if somebody did that to us, it seems like we would be, I don't know, it would make us angry, and yet it seems as though the United States and Japan has enjoyed, seeming at least on the surface, a very good relationship over many years since World War II. How would you categorize America's relationship with Japan right now, bring us up to date on that if you would.
Right. Well, speaking of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, a very good book on the subject. It was written by Professor John Dower. It's called Embracing Defeat, and it described how the Japanese accepted defeat and really in 1945 and determined that they would simply change their whole political economy and their politics. And what emerged from that defeat was a Japan that essentially accepted the U.S. Leadership is the euphemism these days. We hear from Washington, but it really is almost a client-state relationship with the United States. As we know, U.S. bases, forward military bases, occupy a very large part of Japanese territory. We have approximately 30 or 40,000 U.S. Active duty personnel in Japan, mainly in Okinawa. The 7th Fleet is based in Japan. And Japan, for practical purposes, is a U.S. protectorate. It has been at least since World War II. Mm-hmm. That is a very important background, and really not just background. It in a sense defines the most important and most salient feature of U.S.-Japan relations. And I can say that is the most consistent part of U.S.-Japan relations. We remember that during the 80s, when I was in Nagoya, for example, as taking care of the Toyota relationship for Citibank, Japan was felt to be economically unstoppable. It was acquiring the Rockefeller Center and monuments in the United States. I mean, it was considered to be one of the strongest, if not the strongest economic power in the world. Things changed. In the 90s and in the 2000s, Japan experienced a prolonged and is really only now emerging, or maybe it will emerge, emerging from you might say, 20 years or 25 years of almost no growth, at least no nominal growth, because of deflation, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And so the economy completely, in a sense, stopped growing. And Japan, relatively speaking, in economic terms, in social terms, in demographic terms, has diminished in importance in the last 15, 20 years, particularly in Asia, in comparison with China, which has gone the other way. And in terms of U.S.-Japan relationship, whereas Japan in the 90s and in the 80s certainly, Japan was the most important U.S. Relationship in Asia. Now that is either not the case, or it's only true in a very limited way. Mm-hmm. Without any doubt, the most important relationship for the United States and Asia is China. Mm-hmm. That's true now, and will be true in the future. More true in the future. Japan is, I think, unfortunately, quite unhelpfully important as the place where the United States has extended U.S. military power. Mm-hmm. Or where, in a sense, it's the base for a U.S. military dominance of Asia. It provides the staging area, the bases, and in a sense, the context, almost the pretext, because of the alliance with Japan, mutual defense alliance, for continued or even enhanced U.S. Dominance of Asia, the post-World War II order, which I think right now already we see is quite dysfunctional. It's really causing a lot of trouble in Asia. We see that in relations with China, in behavior of China, in disputes in Asia between China and Japan, China and Vietnam, and China and the Philippines and the South China Sea. Very much behind that whole issue, sort of the context of disputes, is U.S. dominance, is the post-World War II order, is, I would say, the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, right, or Asia rebalance strategy. That is all part of the mix, which is causing a very unstable and really, in a sense, dangerous and quite negative environment here in Asia.
Let me ask you, Stephen. Do you think that China's growing dominance economically, it's a rising, the sleeping giant it used to be called when Kissinger and Nixon first went over there, the sleeping giant is waking up quite clearly with very substantial economic growth. Do you think that one of the reasons for Obama's desire or move towards the pivot, and I'd like you to talk about what that is, to pivot American power to Asia, is because of our military-industrial complex, our corporate desire to be a part of that growth and to get a piece of the action? Is that what this is all about? That's one question. And then secondly, how does China feel about such a close relationship and us having a client state, if you will, in their backyard?
Right. Well, I would, first of all, I mean, my first job was in the U.S. State Department after Johns Hopkins SAIS.
Uh-huh.
I spent 5.5 years in the State Department, in most of it in Beijing in 77 to 79, and also then in Japan. After that, it was Citibank, it was Deutsche Bank, it was banking, and as you described, the latter part of it. Because I spent 20 years not in the government, rather in the private sector, I know it doesn't require government policy or government initiatives like the pivot to Asia for U.S. business to compete internationally. In fact, it's often it's the U.S. involvement or government involvement is counterproductive.
Huh.
And U.S. Certainly does not require the pivot to Asia rebalance, so-called, for U.S. companies, private sector to compete successfully and get a piece of the action in Asia. What I believe is behind the so-called rebalance or pivot to Asia is, I'm afraid, it's only the military and it's only the industrial complex that, as you described, is connected to the military part of it that I think is relevant here. The rebalance is essentially Washington, the state, has tried to characterize it otherwise, but it really is all military.
Interesting.
I mean, really all about maintaining military hegemony or dominance, preeminence, I would say. I mean, that's the important concept. The concept that the U.S. military power in Asia would accept no peer, would tolerate no comparable equivalent peer to present itself. So our strategy, our position is we will remain, and we will always remain hugely preeminent and dominant, so that no other power in Asia can challenge it. The United States power in Asia. That is what the so-called rebalance was all about. It was, and frankly, it was about countering rising Chinese power, economic, political, cultural, but also military. And which is why when the most comprehensible part of, and really the only comprehensible part of the so-called rebalance or pivot to Asia is the term strengthen alliances, rededicate, strengthen alliances. So it was all about, really, and the policy has been all about our alliance with, and we have so many alliances in Asia, Korea, South Korea, where we have 30,000 troops, Japan, where we have, as I mentioned, 40 maybe 50,000 troops, plus basing our 7th Fleet here at our Air Force, major Air Force bases. We have alliances, as we know, since Obama's trip in April, with the Philippines now being revived with actual reuse of Clark and Subic Air Base, Clark Air Base and Subic Naval Base, from which we were, in fact, expelled earlier, I guess in the 90s. We have alliance with Thailand, and of course Australia, New Zealand, ANZUS. So the United States essentially has an alliance which circles, alliance structure and system, which circles China, which encircles China at least from on the Pacific side. And this structure set up after World War II against what? Against the Soviet Union.
You're right.
And maintained during the Cold War. What it is doing now, or what it has done since, let's say, the end of the Cold War, 89, 90, is anybody's, you have to ask yourself that question. What purpose has it served? Of course, it served some purpose in Vietnam because it was during the war in Vietnam, because we staged a lot of activity from the various bases.
Sure.
But the fact there has really been no justification for it since at least the end of the Cold War. And in fact, the alliance system, these alliances, so-called U.S. power in Asia, has really not been a force for stability and peace, as we always hear it has been. I mean, the issue really, the what you have to understand is that policy, American policy toward Asia, certainly for the last 20 or 25 years, has been almost completely made but from the Pentagon. I mean, it's been a military-based policy. There's been very little other sort of input, any substance to our policy in Asia. It's really been run out of DOD. Wow. And you one of the most best indications of that is the so-called 2+2 format for how we meet with Japan and discuss our relationship. 2+2 means on each side we have a Minister of Defense or a Secretary of Defense and a Secretary of State and a Foreign Minister on the Japanese side. So we don't just meet Japan in terms of State Department to State Department talking about sort of politics or state politics. The most substantive, important forum where we meet includes DOD. I mean, in fact, it's run by DOD.
Wow.
Plus to format of our sort of relationship. It's an annual meeting. It sets the agenda for our relationship. It really is the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, setting the agenda, and the State Department essentially giving, you might say, cover, diplomatic cover to what is essentially a military relationship, and we know it's not an equal military relationship.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, the so-called Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and Japan obliges the United States to react and, in a sense, come to the aid and defend Japan, but it doesn't require Japan to defend the United States. So it's unequal, but it's unequal because in a way that still satisfies Washington and U.S. policy, and particularly the Department of Defense, because it allows us to station the major part of our military might in Japan. Now, how does China think about this? Well, obviously, our policy, if you ask, it is we will not accept the domination or U.S. policy is that we insist that we will never accept a potentially dominant power rivaling us in Asia, or potentially hostile, potentially dominant power in Asia. Well, what about the Chinese? They're here. It's their part of the world.
Right.
And in fact, they face a dominant, not a potentially dominant, but a dominant and potentially hostile, from time to time hostile, United States and United States alliance system, United States-Japan alliance. That's the reality with which they deal every single day. And you can imagine under those circumstances that they would feel, frankly, threatened.
Right.
And that is the reality of Asian politics. That's why it's really a mess here.
Right.
It is a complete mess. There's so much, frankly, sort of hostility and disquiet and instability in the region. It's really quite concerning.
Right. Stephen, I have to run an idea past you that I read, and I'm racking my brain right now to try to remember the source of this. I don't know if it was possibly Dr. Paul Craig Roberts or who it was, but the idea, the article that was written said that, in fact, going back to the Second World War, that the generals several generals had advised the White House that there was no need to drop the bomb, that the war was basically over and won already. Of course, we've all been told here in America that it was a just thing to do because we saved so many lives. Yeah, there were a lot of Japanese that died, but we saved an awful lot of other lives and more lives. At least that's the propaganda that we've heard here. The story goes that, in fact, the generals, and not just Eisenhower but others amongst them, said it's not necessary, but that, in fact, the decision was made to go ahead and do it anyway, because that would let everybody know who was in charge of the New World Order post-World War II. Does that sound like a crazy idea, or could there be some truth to that?
Well, two parts to the question. One was it necessary? And the second one was the fact that it was done was the purpose
Right.
that we sort of made a demonstration effect.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I doubt very much the latter. I doubt that there would have been a thought that we would be simply sort of showing our might for demonstration purposes and just to establish our dominance in a psychological sense. So I don't believe that part of it.
Uh-huh.
Whether dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whether that was necessary, frankly, I think it was quite controversial. I think the case can be made that it was not necessary. We could have dropped those bombs if we wanted to, in fact, have a demonstration of our power, at least to devastate Japan and kill a lot of people, a lot of civilians. The bombs could have been dropped someplace else, just to show the power of it, demonstrate it. And no doubt in Japan, I think I've seen histories that suggest that if some more time had gone on, some negotiated settlement or some other, Japan could have been persuaded to surrender without those bombs being dropped.
Mm-hmm.
I wish that had been the case. Certainly, of course, the question was unconditional surrender. See, this was
right.
the requirement or the demand of unconditional surrender, which was repeated Potsdam, Cairo, etc. That clearly was something that prolonged the war in terms of, from the Japanese perspective, they couldn't even conceive what that would mean.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I'm sure there was a psychological, cultural gap. What they probably expected to happen after if they had surrendered unconditionally, was probably much more severe, much more damaging than actually happened. They couldn't imagine. I mean, benevolent dictatorship or benevolent victory, magnanimity in victory, I don't think is something is an Asian concept.
Yeah.
At least in those days. Mm-hmm. So they couldn't have imagined that the Americans would have been magnanimous as victors if they'd surrendered. So they just held out until they essentially were at least many of them were annihilated.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, I'd like to change topics just a little bit here, although it's related. What's going on in the Ukraine? What's going on, obviously, with a return, it seems, to a Cold War environment between the United States and Russia. We've started to put sanctions on Russia, threatening them with more sanctions. It seems to me to be driving Russia more into the arms of China to try to work out things with China. And as I listen to what you're saying about China and China's qualms and reservations about having the United States as the dominant, preeminent power in Asia, that there may well be a connection again. Certainly we've seen a movement towards economic alliance. I think there's the gas deal that's been announced and talked about. I don't know if it's been finalized, but at least it seems like both countries are moving forward. Both countries have, China in particular, I understand, has set up oil trading exchanges and gold changing exchanges. I see here where the Russians now are saying that if the United States pushes more sanctions, they are prepared to accept renminbi for exports and other Asian currencies if need be, if the United States pushes more sanctions and makes it difficult for them to conduct banking, international banking payments and so forth. Do you see, could you perhaps comment a little bit on the possibility of the United States maybe driving Russia and China into a stronger alliance? Do you see that happening now?
Well, first of all, let me say that China doesn't have any alliances.
Uh-huh.
This alliance model of interstate relations,
Uh-huh.
from the Chinese perspective, isn't appropriate in the modern world, at least not military alliance. Of course, they have all kinds of what they call strategic alliances and partnerships and that kind of thing for economic purposes. But military alliance, no. It's the U.S., unfortunately, that maintains this idea that these military alliances are the way to organize international politics or organize the world. I certainly think that's not the case. In fact, it's part of the problem, particularly in Asia, between U.S. and Japan and particularly China. China's concept of what they now call a new type of great power relationship, what the Chinese suggested have been advancing and proposing to the Obama administration, is a state-to-state U.S.-China relationship which should supersede alliances. From the Chinese perspective, in fact, it would only work if the United States were to break up the alliance or discontinue the alliances in Asia. It only makes that sense if it's kind of an equal relationship, not where China faces off against the U.S. allied with Korea, allied with and allied with Australia, the Philippines, and Thailand.
Right.
Doesn't work. A state-to-state relationship where the two are pretty much equal and dealing pretty much together makes a lot of sense. In which case, though, Japan would become a kind of a neutral party between them, which I think is actually the only viable new model. But as far as China and Russia is concerned, without any doubt, the pivot to Asia, first of all, was, as we just discussed, was unfortunately simply in a sense, more of the same. I mean, the U.S. doubling up on this alliance system against China. I mean, very, very bluntly and very simply, that is what the policy is all about. And unfortunately, the reality is that the U.S., the Pentagon, the military, is spending almost all of its time, at least until recently, thinking about war with China, how to go to war with China. And the Chinese military, unfortunately, has been mainly about thinking about how to defend itself or go to war with the United States. Of course, the war wouldn't be in the United States unless we're talking about missiles. Of course, we're talking. We're both nuclear powers.
Sure.
Intercontinental ballistic ICBMs, unfortunately, would be part of the scenario. But what U.S. War strategy is usually about is attacking China and keeping China contained in Asia, not in the United States. In other words, it's not really defending ourselves. But go back to Russia and China. So Russia feeling pressure, of course, from on the other side of the world, and yes, the tensions, the situation, the pivot to Asia, the situation in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, and the pivot to Asia, it certainly has, in a sense, created common concerns, common interests between China and Russia to an extent that hasn't been so evident, so clear until recently. And I can see this going on for quite a long time. Maybe getting stronger.
Yeah.
The gas deal, the energy deal, that's been in discussion for many years, 10 years, I think. And if it's coming together now, that's a very good thing. It makes a lot of sense. I think China, of course, is always concerned about its energy security. Part of the reason why it's building a navy to defend its sea lanes. I mean, why should they depend upon the United States?
Yeah.
For their sea lanes? I mean, that's amazing. When China builds a navy to defend its own sea lanes, we think people say that's a threat.
Yeah.
Yet why doesn't just China rely upon the United States to defend?
Yeah.
It's absurd.
Yeah, it'd be like the fox and the fox guarding the chicken coop. They would see it, perhaps.
So it's really absurd. It's ridiculous.
Stephen, I want to ask you about the TPP,
Yes.
the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That is a big part or a key to the pivot, right?
Well, it's
part of it.
In fact, they're trying to, the pivot is really all about strengthening alliances. It's all about it's really the Pentagon. It's the Pentagon's initiative. Come up with, advanced through the State Department by Kurt Campbell, a Pentagon careerist who under Hillary, when Hillary was Secretary of State, she brought in all these Pentagon careerists into the State Department.
Wow.
The State Department essentially became a kind of an off-site DOD.
Wow.
And our foreign policy was essentially written in the Pentagon for the time they were there. It's not much better under Kerry, but the TPP is something else. They're trying to create in people's minds this sense that the pivot to Asia is so comprehensive. It's all about everything and culture and trade and economics. Well, that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
And so your view, what you suggested might be the case with TPP, is I think what Washington would like people to think.
Uh-huh.
That it's part of the pivot. No, TPP it's no doubt important. It's an important policy initiative. What it is certainly about trying to maintain and get the best, create a new order, a new economic or trade, commercial, intellectual property order, global. Well, not just globally. It's around the Pacific, particularly East Asia, that advances, maximizes U.S. interests, maximizes the interest of U.S.
Corporations,
and other vested interests, not just corporations.
Would if one of the TPP countries, signatories to the TPP, are attacked, would that mean that the other members would come to their assistance?
Good point. Well, yes, I guess, but the.
So it says sort of that strategic are those alliances again that the United States is.
TPP obviously is about tariffs. It's about tariff rates. It's about intellectual property. It's about licensing and copywriting and that kind of thing.
It's my understanding that there would be a court that would adjudicate any disputes between the members of the TPP, so that therefore the United States and all the other countries might be giving up some of their own sovereign interest and would have to abide by whatever the TPP court came up with. Is that your understanding?
Well, I have done some research on TPP. It's a big topic here in Japan. And but the trouble is that it's so secret.
Yeah, that's what I understand. Yeah,
it is being negotiated in such a high level of secrecy. Nobody knows. I mean, it's very hard to know what is going to come out of it. So I can't answer your question.
Okay.
It's
yeah, it is being pushed through by Obama, seemingly, without any kind of discussion in the media about it at all. So it's very troubling, these kinds of arrangements, to me.
Well, my discussion with Stephen Harner went on much longer than I anticipated, so we had to take a break after talking about U.S. relations with Japan and China in light of Obama's pivot into Asia and the rising tensions that are resulting from the military-industrial complex and its policies aimed at controlling countries around the world, and specifically those in Asia. But don't go away, because coming up next, Stephen applies his work in the financial arena to give us some ideas about investment opportunities in Japan and China. So stick around and listen to the next segment with former State Department operative and investment banker Stephen Harner. Don't go away. Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm back here with Stephen Harner. During the first segment today, Stephen applied his experience as a former State Department operative to help us understand the dynamics of U.S. relations with Japan and China, and in general with countries in Asia. Now in the second segment, I want to talk to Stephen a little bit about the economics of both of those countries, Japan and China, and possibly find out if there's some good investment opportunities in either of those countries. So Stephen,
I want to get on to a couple of economic issues. You are certainly very much involved. Your bio says that you're involved in mergers and acquisitions.
Yes.
Work that you're doing now. Talk to us a little bit about the Japanese economy isn't doing well, and the Chinese economy also may be slowing down a bit, if not worse. That's the impression I get from the mass media, the propaganda on this side of the world. What is your take on the economy of both Japan and China at this point in time?
Right. Well, Japanese economy is it's restructuring. Mm-hmm. The important thing I think for listeners to understand is that Japan still has many world-beating, world-class, big companies that we all know: Toyota, Hitachi, Toshiba, Nissan, the automakers, the big engineering firms, many other companies, including brand names like Sony and Panasonic and SoftBank. Increasingly, people are familiar with that one, NTT. Mm-hmm. Japan has these really huge and, in many cases, globally very competitive companies, but they had, over 20 years, 15 years, lost a lot of momentum. They lost a lot of profitability for various reasons. And what's been going on for the last 10 or 15 years is a slow process of restructuring, re-engineering, repositioning, and I think we're beginning to finally see the results of that. The stock market, as you know, from when Abe became prime minister in December of 2012, is up about 50%. Mm-hmm. And many of the stocks in it are up much more than that. Sony, for example, has doubled, and many of the others have also got almost doubled. Mm-hmm. This reflects a couple of things. It reflects the yen, finally a weakening of the yen to a more reasonable level. It had strengthened to 75 yen to the dollar, which was punishing. It was just a punishingly overvalued yen-dollar rate, which made it very hard for any of the companies in Japan to compete globally and to make profits. I mean, they could sell, but they wouldn't make profits. And if they brought and the profit, overseas profits, let's say the dollars they brought back, could only be converted into 75 yen for their domestic operations and their reporting purposes. Mm-hmm. So it was terrible. Now the yen-dollar is 102 yen to the dollar. It's up 25% or more yen depreciation, devaluation, which has been a boost to the competitiveness and the balance sheets and the earnings of most of Japan's internationally active companies, and particularly including the banks. I mean, the banks lending abroad with assets in foreign currency, with the yen so strong, those assets were undervalued. But now with the yen is weaker, the overseas assets, and the cash flows from overseas lending activity or other activity have obviously grown. just in terms of the impact on their income. And so the internationally active banks, Mitsubishi, UFJ, Sumitomo, Mitsui, etc., are all very substantially up in terms of their earnings and their outlook. So Japan is, you might say, I think it's back. It's back for structural reasons, the changes, the restructuring, the efficiencies, a positive reaction to globalization, international competitiveness, instead of a very defensive and quite unsuccessful response, is what we see more often now in Japan. Hitachi is an excellent global company, which we see as a good example of this restructuring. It's substantially restructuring. Hitachi is an equivalent, you might say, a competitor to GE and IBM in certain ways. Siemens, and they have turned around. They were losing money a couple of years ago, and they're turned around under some really excellent new managers. I can't leave Japan without talking about SoftBank. We know about Masayoshi Son, the entrepreneur, Korean-Japanese, who runs that company. They bought Sprint in the United States. He bought Sprint. I think it was $20-some billion. And now, through Sprint, they're merging with T-Mobile to take a major part of the U.S. Mobile telephone market. So we've got some interesting entrepreneurs here, and we've got a restructuring economy. So I think, the headwinds are demographic, and you might say, primarily demographics. In Japan, population is shrinking, the working age population is shrinking. Domestic demand is not going to go far. If we grow 1%, 2%, that's already very, very good. So Japan's companies have to become more globally competitive, and they are doing so. China, yes, it's slowing. Overall growth, what will it be? GDP growth will be maybe 7 to 7.5 this year. And China is also, the economy of China is also restructuring from an investment-driven and export-driven sort of growth, export-led, investment-led growth, to much more, you might say, internal demand. It's becoming a more mature economy. And certain sectors like property, housing, have been overbuilt. Actually, there's a lot of overinvestment, capacity, surplus in various industries in China, stemming to a great extent from the policy, you might say the stimulus policy, that of the government that was in power before, or existed before the current government of Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang. Li Keqiang, the premier, Xi Jinping, the president, also, of course, party chairman. The previous government, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, Hu Jintao, the president, Wen Jiabao, the premier, during the global financial crisis, decided to do their own version of stimulus, and just flooded the market with, ordered the Chinese banks to lend money, and created a very large debt-driven, lending-driven overcapacity in so many industries. It was just a lot of wasted investment, and the economy is now working through this. And the overinvestment in property in particular is sort of worrying. But I do believe that both China and Japan will sort of get through this without any major hard landings. And particularly the hard landing story on China is often heard. I don't believe it. I think China is doing quite okay. They still save 50% of their GDP every year, which covers a lot of problems.
Yeah.
If you have a high savings rate, you can do a lot. You can be wasteful. You can be inefficient, but you still can work through your problems, and that's still the huge strength of China. Plus the the competitiveness, the entrepreneurism of the economy, and some good macroeconomic now policies, mainly to do less from Beijing.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a good recipe for almost any country to do less if governments would step aside and let people be free. I can't let you go without asking you about the savings rate now that you brought it up with China. Japan used to be known for its savings rate. I think I saw recently they used to save about 20%, which is a far cry from China. But Japan now, according, if these numbers are correct, was something like 3%. And then with the demographics that you mentioned, the headwinds of demographics in Japan also blowing very hard, that in fact that could go negative sometime in the future. Does that concern you with respect to Japan? Certainly in the United States, everybody's Keynesian, at least Japan and the United States alliances are all pushing forward to dis-savings and consuming more than you save almost. That seems to be the idea of Lord Keynes, that's how you create wealth, is not by savings and saving and working hard and spending and investing wisely and producing, but rather by consuming. So does that worry you at all about China, about Japan, their savings rate?
Yeah, it's a huge worry. It is probably the biggest danger. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that, as often is said, and people sort of understand now, I mean, Japan's debt rate is something like 200% of GDP. Mm-hmm. And the story has always been, well, that's okay. It can be, it's acceptable because, and that debt rate, incidentally, results from 20 years of Keynesian policies. Essentially,
sure.
More and more government program deficit spending to stimulate. Mm-hmm. Since the bubble burst in 1989 in Japan, when the Nikkei average was 37,000, now it's 15,000. Mm-hmm. The successive governments have relied upon these stimulus programs, spending money, deficit spending, and which resulted only really in accumulated government debt. Mm-hmm. And now we're close to 200% GDP. The reason we often heard this was not such a big problem as well. This is all financed internally. It's all Japanese financing Japanese, and it's not a problem because it's not foreign debt, et cetera.
Right.
It's not the foreigners.
Right.
Well, that on a flow basis rather than a stock basis, that's only true as long as domestic savings is sufficient to absorb the 30% or 50% of the budget every year, which is deficit financed. And that what we're talking about is private savings covering government deficit. If private savings, household savings in particular, go negative, as they are beginning to, pretty soon. There have been studies to show. I mean, there's some projections that negative overall savings will simply require Japan to sell its debt abroad to attract many more foreign investors to support to refinance the government debt, the Japanese government bonds, JGBs, that previously had been financed domestically. Well, when that happens, you're not going to. It has to compete globally in terms of interest rates. Mm-hmm. Now the JGB famously, they started zero interest rate QE, 0% interest rate QE. They started that in fact 20 years ago.
Yeah.
The Bank of Japan innovated this policy.
Uh-huh.
The Fed has followed it. So government deficit has been financed very cheaply, almost for nothing, because it's only been a domestic rate which could be manipulated by the Bank of Japan. What happens if they have to sell their debt abroad? Well, if they sell their debt abroad, let's even say that 1% becomes 2%. Mm-hmm. That interest rate on government debt becomes 2% on government debt.
Right, and that's big because of the enormous amount of debt that the government holds.
Right now, 20%, 20 or 25% of their government debt budget every year is debt service. Mm-hmm. happens if the interest rate doubles? That figure doubles to 50% of the government deficit every year, or their government budget every year. Is that sustainable?
No, you wouldn't think so.
No, that's a recipe for really.
Well, I think it was David Stockman that was talking about the other day that, in fact, that the JGB is funding a good part of it, around 50% at the present time. So I guess the whole notion, as long as all the countries continue to push their interest rates lower, but how much below zero can they go? I guess you can drive rates to negative. You can start to do what do you call it, bail-in or whatever. You charge people for keeping money in their accounts or whatever. But it seems to me a recipe for disaster. Well, all of this non-free market economics is getting, I think, the world into a lot of trouble. But let's just set that aside because we're almost out of time. In fact, we've run over. But Steve, it's been very interesting listening to your ideas, and I want to pass them on to my listeners, so that it's not a problem. I would like to ask you, though, since you are involved in the investing world, how do you? I mean, are there places you have some? You mentioned some very giant Japanese companies. I'm wondering if some of those companies might not be good investments long term. Are they paying any dividends? They're good, solid companies for sure. And then there's merger and acquisition opportunities. Do you see some investment opportunities for Americans, perhaps, in China? And if so, by way of, say, an ETF, or are there some companies in China that trade over here that you think might be good for people to take a look at?
Right. Well, what we see now from Japan are Japanese companies primarily going abroad. Although there's the Nikkei today, the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, the financial daily in Japan, which I read every day, has a front page story about the percentage of Japanese companies that are now owned by foreigners or foreign shareholders. And let me I'll just look at it here. Quote it. Right, first front page, Nihon Keizai Shimbun, June 15th, and it has categorized quite a number of companies here. One is globally companies that are, well, let's do this one. The theme is companies that are structurally reforming themselves and finding and experiencing financial improvements, substantial financial improvements. IHI, that's a very big and very well-known engineering company, which trades an ADR in New York. It's 36% owned by foreign investors. Panasonic, and incidentally, over the last year, that figure has increased by 13 points. So huge increase in foreign investors in IHI. Panasonic is 33% owned currently by foreign investors. That's up 7.9 points. Hitachi, I mentioned, is 45.4% owned by foreigners. That's up 400 basis points. I myself am an owner of ADRs of Hitachi. Next comes Toyota Motor, which is 30% owned by foreigners currently. We got some stocks that in Japan that also most of these have ADRs.
Sure.
They, for example, Mitsubishi Real Estate or Mitsui Real Estate is now 50% owned by foreigners. That's up 2.4 points. This story here, this theme of that investment would be retail sales in Japan, and the sort of successful domestic companies with domestic market. Another very interesting one is 7 & I, which runs 7-Eleven stores here in Japan. That's 35% owned by foreigners. some of the global names that we know from Japan, which all have ADRs. Shiseido, the electronics, the cosmetics company, 35.5% owned by foreigners, up 13 or 14 points in 1 year. Dentsu is the advertising company, which getting a big boost from the 2020 Olympics, which Tokyo has captured.
Oh.
And so many companies will want to come in and advertise for the Olympics. They are up. They are 27.9% owned by foreigners. That's up 12.6 points from doubled. That foreign ownership has doubled over the past year because of the Olympics, without any doubt. Kao, the detergent soap company.
So there's a lot of names here, Stephen. Do some of these pay some dividends?
Oh yeah,
and pretty good yields.
They do. What you find is of course, it depends on the company. Actually, the dividend rate of the banks is very high now, something like 5%. Dividend yield, and the EPS yield is close to 8 or 9%. Very high.
Let me ask you. Let me just ask you, because we do need to conclude our discussion. But let me ask you if I could get your ideas on China just a little bit, if you would. The Chinese equity market, the U.S. equity market, of course, has really set new highs, whereas China over the last couple of years, since 2011 or so, has sort of been pretty weak. Yes. As a matter of fact, it's been negative, and one analyst, technical analyst that I follow over here, who's been pretty spot on, is suggesting that people might want to take a look at China. Now, China is difficult for Americans, I think, to invest in individual Chinese companies, but ETFs are out there. Any names in China that Americans...
Yeah, ETFs, and you've got QFII, qualified foreign institutional investors, which basically run the ETFs. I mean, that's a category of foreign investors which is permitted to buy A shares. Many of the Chinese biggest companies are traded in Hong Kong, H shares. And a few of them, like C-Trip, for example, which I own, are NASDAQ. Their offshore vehicles are listed in New York. Yes, the market's down. The Shanghai index, something like just a little over 2,000. It's been in the doldrums a long time, and I don't have any particular right now names to mention except C-Trip.
Okay. Well, that's fine.
Because it's a domestic travel and now international travel company.
Yeah, and the Chinese are doing a lot of traveling now, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Stephen, I want to thank you very much. We really do have to conclude now, but I want to thank you very much for your generous time, sharing your time and your ideas and your knowledge and experience in Asia. I think you brought some very valuable insights into our discussion. I want to thank you very much, and would like to talk to you again sometime.
Very well. Great. Okay. Thank you very much.